All right. We are all set. Hey guys, welcome on in here to our user group webinar here today. My name is Jim and I'm coming to you live on a rainy day here in Columbus, Ohio. For February, we'll take it. It's not icing. It's not an ice storm out there. What we're going to do today, we're going to have a webinar covering the settings window in the accounting module, as well as some of the basics of transactions in the accounting module. We're not going to talk about specific transaction types, but just some of the basics about how they work. A little primer to get us ready to start talking about more advanced topics in the accounting module going forward from here. So just a little quick webinar here today. Before we go ahead and get started with that, a word about your GoToWebinar control panel, which is on your screen there. There is a small red or orange button, usually in the upper left-hand corner with an arrow on it, that you can use to either minimize or maximize that control panel. Minimizing that thing gives you a little bit more room on your display, your computer monitor, to see what we're getting into in our session here today. Maximizing it will get you to the different functions of that control panel, specifically the questions section. I don't anticipate going for the full 20 minutes here today, and I will leave the room open for a bit after that for any questions that you do have. I do ask that you limit the questions to the specific topics at hand here today. If you have more in-depth questions or questions specifically about your chart of accounts or your accounting module, we do have a support line, which is at 800-533-5227. We got a ton of helpful support staff there that will be glad to help you out. Okay, so let's go ahead and start taking a look here at our accounting module. We're running Church Windows version 20, which many of you folks have received your notifications that version 20 is available, but not everybody. We're kind of releasing it in smaller groups, so not everybody has received your version 20 downloads as yet, but they're coming. Everybody on our update and support program will be receiving those eventually, but the version 20 is what we're running in our webinar here today. So let's go ahead and open up accounting here. Any minute now. There we go. Okay, so first thing we want to cover here. Oh, the other thing I did want to mention, if you do own any of our regional training manuals that we have available for sale, we're just going to be covering pages 2, 3, and 4 in the accounting A103 manual. So the third of our accounting manuals, just the first couple of pages of that one is what we're going to be covering in here in our session here today. First thing we want to talk about is the settings screen. So if you go to in the accounting module, there's a series of tabs you can use along the top here. If you go to the special functions tab along the top, you'll see the settings button, this second from the left here. So the settings screen here is, we set our default settings here for the accounting module on here. So a quick tour of what we do over here. The default accounts that you see here for asset account, for default pay method if you're running payments in accounting, as well as pay method for collections if you're one of our customers that uses the accounts receivable package in our accounting module. These things are what you set here on this screen that save you a couple of clicks when you're entering the appropriate transactions in the system. So for the default asset account, for example, once you set this here, anytime you're entering a transaction that affects your assets will kind of auto-populate with that default checking account. So if you're on the enter income transaction, if you're on the pay bills transaction, money being withdrawn or deposited into your asset accounts, it'll automatically populate with that checking account that you have set there. It'll save you a click or two when you're posting those types of transactions. Also for the payments, for the pay bills transaction, if you set the default pay method here, it will automatically populate to that as well. Computer prepared check, which is what we have ours set to, are the checks that you can print directly out of the Church Windows accounting module. So the pre-formatted checks that you can print to right here from accounting. Manual checks are what you would write out of a checkbook, sort of outside of Church Windows. You just kind of scratch them out separately outside of Church Windows. Cash transactions, electronic file transfer transactions, debit card, credit card are the payment methods that we have in our program here. And same for collections. If you run accounts receivable, different types of payment methods for collections there. You generate invoice numbers. If you're using accounts receivable, this is where the number that you start with, and then they count up from there. Default print on deposit slip for collections. If you want these collections to print on the deposit slip report, it defaults to doing that. So the check boxes over here on the right side here always confirm and ask me about printing after posting transactions. That is, every time you post any of these transactions, if that is checked, it's going to ask you if you want to, if you're sure you're all set, and if you want to print a transaction journal for what you just posted in the system. If you uncheck that, it'll just post your transactions and it won't nag you about printing a report. And then there's also the reset screen sizes and positions button over there. Different windows in the accounting module can be moved to different places. And sometimes they can get sort of out of whack, and you've got windows in positions that you can't get to very easily. Resetting the screen sizes to their default locations basically centers everything again back in accounting, and you can get back to where you can locate that more easily if your windows get messed up in the accounting module. So that's the settings section there for the accounting module. Okay, so basic transactions here in accounting is the next topic we're going to cover. The tabs that I mentioned earlier that go along the top of our accounting window up here, if you go to the transactions tab, you're going to see a series of buttons here with all of the basic transactions we've got here in our system here. Browsing is where you can look at all of the transactions that you've already got in the system. That's where you can correct or reverse existing transactions. It also allows you to print reports from there as well. You can enter income from here. The majority of the income that you record in for Church Windows accounting, if you own the donations module, is going to come as transfers from donations here into accounting. That's going to be the bulk of your income that you record. But you can also record income from other sources like building rentals or interest on savings accounts. You can record that there. Money from the soda pop machine in the hallway, things like that. When you got bills to pay in Church Windows, that's a two-step process. That's these next two buttons. Entering bills is where you record into the system that you owe money to somebody. So your various vendors you got in the system, you record that you owe money to your vendors. That is also the step where the expense is recorded to your church as an expense account. And then pay bills is where you actually pay that vendor. And that is the step where the money actually comes out of your various checking accounts that you have set up in the system. So enter bills, you record that you owe money to somebody. Pay bills is where you actually pay them. Transfers allow you to move money from one type of account to the same type of account. So from an asset to an asset, you just kind of transfer money from one asset to another, transfer money from one of your fund balances to another, as long as it's the same type of account, you can transfer money in that way. Accounts receivable is for folks who have usually like a daycare, and you bill folks for use of your daycare. Is the most common use of that. It's a billing module, basically, is what that stuff is there. Transferring donations is when, after you record giving over in the donations module, you can either transfer it from donations directly into accounting, but right here from donations you can, or from accounting, pardon me, you can click that button and bring that money over as well. Those are the basic transactions there. Underneath other here, you've got some other optional transactions, including journal entries right here, which a lot of our people with accounting backgrounds have a tendency to like to use those types of transactions for more unusual circumstances there. So for every transaction that you record here in Church Windows, they all get a number. And every time you open up a new accounting year, every transaction that you record in accounting begins with the number 1. So your first transaction of every year is 1, and it counts up from there. Also, every transaction that you record also gets tagged with the type of transaction that it was. And you see that if you go to your browse screen. So if I click on browse, this is where we see our transactions that we have in the system. And the two things I'm talking about here. Here's the transaction number. So our first transaction is 1. We see it's a multi-line transaction, and it goes up from there. But also, let me expand that so you get a better sense here. Transaction types. So they're also tagged with a transaction type. You can see what all the different transaction types are if you go to this button in the upper left-hand corner where it says Change Year, Filter, and Sort. This is where you can kind of filter your grid, your transaction grid, in any way that you see fit here. But there's a section in the lower right-hand corner with all of the different transaction types. So you'll see here, for example, this transaction number 1, it's transaction 1, and it's a DONA, which means, as you see right over here, that it's a donations type transaction. So they all have those codes associated with them that let you know the type of transaction that you're looking at here. Okay, so all transactions are tagged in that way with a number as well as a transaction type. And again, you see that in the transaction number column as well as the type column here. All of your transactions that you have entered into your system will have a date occurred, which we see in this column right here, which is the date of that transaction as it is recorded in your system. So the donation transfer occurred on January 7th. This entered bill that you have right here is recorded on January 15th, etc. In addition to the date occurred, which is the date that a transaction hits the system, there is also a date recorded, or pardon me, a date posted. And if I scroll to the right, you'll see date posted listed over here. So the date posted is actually the date that somebody sat in a chair in front of the computer and entered that transaction into the system. So the date recorded, or pardon me, date posted oftentimes is going to be different than the date occurred. You can forward date or back date any transaction in accounting. So just because you're sitting in your chair on February 23rd doesn't mean that all of your transactions have to be be dated on the 23rd. You can forward date them or backdate them. So that is the date posted. If you have usernames and passwords recorded in Church Windows, you have different logins. It's also going to tell you who was logged into the system when the transaction was posted. We don't use passwords for our training data here, so you'll see universal login for all of these transactions on our grid here. Okay. So those are some of the important things that you'll see with all of those transactions. Had a question come in. Why are we missing some transaction numbers? We weren't sorted by transaction number on our grid. So when I click on my little transaction number box here at the top, now it's going to be sorted by transaction number. So you'll see all of your numbers listed in here. Also, if we had reversed a transaction, you might see a gap in these numbers as well because we're not showing reverse transactions on our grid here. So we had gaps in our numbers in this case because we weren't sorted by transaction number, but it also might be because you had some reversed transactions in your system here. So that are kind of the way your various transactions are going to be, the different properties of the different transactions that are assigned when you record them. Okay. Another thing I want to kind of point out for our webinar here today, the Church Windows accounting module is a dual entry accounting system. So for folks with an accounting background, this is going to be, of most interest to you folks. All of the transactions that you enter into the system, if you want to come in here and you enter a bill and then you pay a bill, the specific effects of the debits and the credits to those transactions aren't going to show up on your screen. Church Windows is going to be smart enough to know how to record all of these debits and credits because every transaction has both sides to it in your system here. If you were to come in here and post a journal entry transaction, for example, that's when you would need to be mindful of the effects of those debits and credits for your transactions. What I'm going to show you, we've got a little grid that shows you the effects of debits and credits in our help files. So I'm going to click on this little question mark right here on our opening screen to take us to our help screen in Church Windows. And from here, the topic I'm looking for is basic transactions. Oh, wait a minute. Is it just basic transaction? I had found this earlier today. Let's see. Sorry, folks. I had done this search earlier before I started this webinar, and it came right up. And I thought it was basic transactions. Let's see. Good times. I'm sorry, this is taking a minute here. Where was it? Oh, good times. I apologize, folks. I think I was on a different computer. I actually think I had a different help file I was looking at before. So therefore, well, phooey. Credits and debits. I need to see the effects of credits and debits. Okay, I'm going to improvise then. Sorry, folks. Bear with me for a moment. Let me open up Okay. There are 5 different types of accounts in church windows. Oh, under basic. Okay. Somebody else help me out here. Is it basic? Reports directory exports. Yeah, I'm still not seeing it. I'm not seeing it. There are 5 different types of accounts in church windows. And I'm going to do a quick grid for you here. There are assets. There are liabilities. There are fund balances. There are incomes. And there are expenses. There are these accounts. Let me insert. Those accounts, when you're looking at your chart of accounts, are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are the numbering schemes for those types of accounts. The effects of crediting and debiting. So again, every transaction has a debit side and a credit side to it. The ones on the outside of this grid, assets as well as expenses, behave the same way. And to my non-accountant brain, they act in the way I don't expect them to. So in other words, when you debit an asset account, it increases. And when you credit it, it decreases. SES. Oops. Expenses is the same way. So when you credit an asset account, in other words, your checking account, it actually goes down when you credit it. When you debit it, it goes up. The 3 in the middle do the opposite. They increase when you credit them, and they decrease when you debit them. This is what I was hoping to just find in my help file until I messed all that up. So sorry about that, folks. Get rid of that. So here's, and again, this is going to be of more interest to our accountants, people with an accounting background in there, okay? So of the 5 different types of accounts, this is the way they behave when you debit them versus when you credit them, okay? So assets and expenses, debits increase them, credits decrease them. Liabilities, fund balances, and incomes do the opposite. They decrease when you debit them. They increase when you credit them. Okay, so that is the effects of those. Me fumbling around and tripping over my own feet here did carry this to about the 20-minute mark. I apologize about that for taking the extra time. But honestly, that is the entirety of the topics that we needed to cover here today. So we are all set with that. At this time, if you're all set to go, thank you so much for joining me and fumbling around with me here today. Feel free to go ahead and click the X in the upper right-hand corner of your GoToWebinar control panel and have a lovely afternoon. I am going to leave the room open for a bit to hit any questions that you might have. Some folks kind of popped up a couple of questions as we went as well. Cassandra was curious about paying bills without entering them first. Yes, you absolutely can. Certain types of bills that you pay don't have a bill entered first. So for example, a mortgage payment, you have a rather large loan. You don't enter a bill every time. It's just this large amount of money that you owe to somebody. So your liability is this large number, and you just pay the bill on a monthly basis or whatever and reduce it from there. So yeah, you can pay bills without entering them first, but you have to have a liability that you owe money to in order to do that. So